The subject today is the essentials of democracy and Islamic perspective. This is a continuation of the previous talks that we've had on democracy and we've had on Islam and its effects on democracy. So let's first revert to Islam as a religion, and it takes me to my book, which has a title called "What is this thing called religion, for God's sake?" Now, religion, from the perspective of dictionaries and from the perspective of my understanding, and God knows better, is a social science, and it is there for the management of societies, having emerged during the course of evolution of the human civilization. So if we see religion having evolved in human history, we have seen human civilization, and that would mean the level of human knowledge over the years, and religion has therefore come over the years and evolved over the years to interface with the level of human civilization that did exist in different periods of human history and time. When we come to categorizing religion, then primarily we see that there are only two. First one is a monotheistic religion, where you have one deity of worship and you have a certain set of laws, norms, traditions and rituals that influence society within the framework of that monotheistic belief. The other form of religion is polytheistic, which is based on mythologies, fear, and the unknown. In recorded history, you find that polytheistic religions have worshipped the sun, worshipped the water, worshipped fire, worshipped trees, worshipped animals, anything they could not easily tame, understand, reason, rationalize, became an object of worship. In fact, humans have been worshipped as well, and the first human to have been worshipped as God was a pregnant woman, for instance, because the aspect of rationality, reason, was unknown, absent, and therefore became an object of worship. Now, from the perspective of monotheistic religions, Islam has evolved into the ultimate religion, and it came with a book which claims to have the knowledge of everything wet and dry created by God. And it comes with a challenge of being irrefutable. And 1500 years of its history, the claim stands to be accurate and in place. Now, this very religion, this irrefutable monotheistic religion called Islam, comes with a lot of wisdom, comes with a lot of explanations, comes with a knowledge base which is essential for anybody that subscribes to the religion with a clear understanding that it is a knowledge base which one is supposed to take advantage of, subscribe to, understand, and use as a benchmark for the purposes of managing societies or managing a society on a judicious plane, on a judicious basis. Now, with this particular definition of the religion, and particularly the religion of Islam, we have to now view the efficacy of democracy. We have to view the method of governance, and we have to see what an ideal structure, at least with our present level of civilization, understanding, and material technology that does exist, social fabrics that do exist, can be used, and this knowledge base can be applied. Now, when we carry the word democracy to this benchmark of the religion of Islam, we will be able to see very clearly that popular opinion is at the root of democracy or a democratic norm. The question is that does this popular consensus, this popular will, this popular method is of any reasonable worth and value when it comes to the question of governance, when it comes to the question of using popular will, i.e. democracy, in a social environment. And we will probably come to the conclusion that popular will in any social environment has a merit. That merit revolves around a factor of accountability first, where people check their own kind, their own lot, their own environment for excesses that may be caused by any person individually or by a set of people collectively. So, a factor of audit and accountability is the prime merit of a democratic order. The second thing which is merit-worthy in a democratic environment is the spirit of competition. Competitive spirits set in because an individual, by the very nature of his own creation, seeks to excel in any faculty for the purposes of social recognition. So from the Islamic perspective, the factor of democracy or the institution of democracy has just these two efficacies to be adopted. Now, if we move with this background and view governance, then in the current world situation where we have nation states and governance of these nation states, particularly from the Islamic perspective, is a challenge. We will see that it becomes incumbent that we use the institution of democracy for the purposes of the merit it carries in the development, management, and establishment of governing institutions, be it the army, be it the civil bureaucracy, be it the judiciary. They have to be essentially democratic in their structure of management. We will also notice that as managemental sciences have evolved over time, the typical pyramid structure for the management of institutions, corporates, countries is no more in the pyramid form, where you have the chief sitting at the top and authority filtering down to the bottom. Modern managemental science has produced inverted pyramids, and these inverted pyramids, the authority, though it rests with the chief, but he sits at the bottom as a regulator and as a principal auditor of the institution and its operations. Which brings us to another very interesting dimension of management, that in the management of corporates, in the management of countries, in the management of institutions, the knowledge base of everybody within the managing cadre have to be trained, familiar, and know to what they are required to do, job descriptions. So the first point of contact and the chief of the institution are all familiar with the standard operating procedure, the reason, the purpose, and the processes that inflict management. There is therefore no place for people who are not trained and are not familiar with processes and do not have a sense of belonging to the professional level of expertise that are required to be able to man institutions or factors of governance where you have a cluster of institutions. So democracy at that level is contained. But ironically, we see a recipe, a distorted recipe or a different recipe that have been marketed, engineered, and sold to the rest of the world, essentially by colonists, where democracy has become a form of government. So today we find martyrs in the Muslim world who are claimants of protectors of the Western recipe for democracy. The Western recipe for democracy is popular opinion of the entire lot of population to put a government in office. Now, democracy, this nature of democracy is very porous, extremely manipulative, and it completely denies the Islamic understanding and respect of the term democracy. Because from the Islamic perspective, the term democracy is linked to Shura, which is consultative council, and this consultative council cannot be based on adult franchise, as it is called, of popular consensus development for government. In fact, it jeopardizes the entire process of decision taking and decision making and the judicious following of legislation. In fact, it supports and installs monolithic rulers that then subvert the trust of the people for personal gain. So what is the order of governance, essentially from the Islamic perspective? We have the institution of democracy, right? But when it comes to applying it on a population, that is only for selecting in small pockets, leaders that represent different pockets of the population, that would represent them in a consultative assembly of men that would enable legislation. So direct democracy at the grassroots levels is restricted for the selection of an able person for a pocket of population. That is why in my book, The Current Chronicles, I have recurrently, and even in my advice to the government over the last 2 decades, whichever government has been in office, advise the efficacy of 100% urbanization in the country so that this democratic norm can be achieved from the perspective of our ideology, the Islamic ideology, and that the assemblies are then made up of learned people whose consultative counsel can be of worth and value for the protection, safeguard, development, welfare of the population at large. It also prevents any form of monolithic governance, and it certainly establishes the status of the governors as servants of the governed. Now, these are fine points from the perspective of Islam, from the perspective of democracy in Islam, and from the perspective of judicious management of societies. The only element in an Islamic pattern of governance which stays out without being partisan as neutral umpires is the institution of the judiciary, which is the best paid and responsible for establishing divine justice. This is an institution that has to be free from the executive and has to be free from any form of influence, any form of political factors or expediency. And this is essentially how the fabric or the governing model in an Islamic nation state, if you like, or a society should be in place. The head of the judiciary, therefore, is inevitably the head of the government. What works under him is the executive, is that arm that protects the society, which is the armed forces. And what works under him, of course, is the processes that inflict the management, operation of the civil bureaucracy and the armed forces that protect the social environment. The executive has to be based on a decision-making mechanism that is research-based, so that they are in pace with the research and development and the levels of technology as it evolves on a constant basis. So the factors of shura, the factors of ijtihad, the factors of constant migration in the levels of knowledge, and the factors of judicious management is essentially the fabric of governance in Islam. It is incumbent that we divorce ourselves from the recipe dished out at us from the West for the term democracy, and we restrict ourselves to the understanding of the order for democracy and based on that for governance within the consonance of our own ideology, i.e. the message of Islam. Religious edicts and the usurpation of authority are essentially political tools that have been used in history and are constantly being used in history today in most Islamic territories of the world, Pakistan inclusive. And based on this particular narration, I implore my viewers to reflect on the way forward. We will see from the Pakistan experiment that has tried all sorts of governing methods, from conservative Islam to liberal Islam to socialism to democracy from the West, that we have brought absolute misery and decadence in our social setup. And today we stand at the brink of disaster when it comes to any direction forward. Ideally, the whole system has to be scrapped, to be reconstructed and reviewed. We have to also essentially look at the factors that have subject us to this particular misery, and they revolve around economics, again from the perspective of Islam. We have to settle for economic independence in its complete form. The rule of the game is simple, and that is the usage of the natural and human resources available in a political territory for use that can benefit the population within the same political territory. Our reliance on our own medium of exchange, on our own natural resources, on our own human resources, equitably, is the answer. However, while we structure this, we have to be cautious about the replication or the repetition of economic vibrance that inflicted two major societies on the planet, one in the communist and socialist regions, and the other in the capitalist regions. Today, the monolithic governments that exist in the West lean heavily on corporate giants whose insatiable greed forces them to be oppressors on the global population. That is why the largest commodity of their trade are arms and ammunition. Similarly, in the communist and socialist world, the hyped up factors of production forces them to take away for their production machinery the natural resources from primarily the Muslim world up to 56%. It is interesting to reflect back on to the history of the prophets when they were sent to the earth, and by our belief 124,000 of them, until the last prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that they all emerged at a time when society had leaned to one of the two extremes: extreme materialism or extreme mysticism. And they all came with one job description, was to set the balance right. So, for us in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, there is present an opportunity of either redevising our model and becoming an example for the world, or living with the status quo and being witnesses to the state withering away into oblivion, which is almost a writing on the wall. I rest my case. Thank you.